welcome back to the lecture series. We are talking about novel and existence in the light of the Heideggerian concept of Dasein or being. So, when we talk of interval sign, you know, and when we talk of interval sign, we will see how this connects with the larger discussion that we have been having, the generic discussion, what novel is, the literary genre that novel is, how it is very similar to what Heidegger defines us or understands as interval sign. Heidegger calls the activity of existence or existing actively, the task of existing as being in the world, interval sign. He emphasized that the being in the context of Dasein's being in the world is not to be understood as a characteristic of objects simply spatially located with respect to one another. It's not just a spatial correlation of objects. This is something I mentioned in my previous lecture. Now, Heidegger calls the way of being of objects understood as isolated, determinate substances as Vorhandenheit. This is one term he uses, Vorhandenheit, which is usually translated to English as presence at hand. However, there is no mention of presence in the original language in which Heidegger is writing. So, Heidegger is writing in German, and since there is no mention of the word presence in the German, one could translate Vorhandenheit as occurrentness. So, the closest to Vorhandenheit would be occurrentness. The most general characteristics of occurrent objects are called categories. So, there is an ontological distinction between being in as an existential and then the category of insideness that objectively existing things can have with regard to one another. So, something that I can outwardly see as objectively being present in the world, and then that object's, insideness, and the insideness of two objects interacting with one another, that kind of creates a complex nexus of interactions, and this is something that quite interests a genre such as the novel, right? We have already used a term such as interillumination. So, the Dasein has its own being in space, which in turn is possible only on the basis of being in time, being in the world in general. So, the Dasein has its own being in space, which is possible only on the basis of being in the world in general. Being in the world is as much a spiritual quality as the spatiality of human being, an attribute based on corporeality, right? So, being in the world is not only dealing with the matter, that is to say, it also has its spiritual quality, just as spatiality of human being is greatly based on corporeality. So, the understanding of being in the world as an essential structure of the Dasein makes possible the insight into its existential spatiality. So, being in the world of the Dasein with its facticity is already dispersed in different ways of being in, right? We are here not talking about a general being in the world, but if the general being in the world already assumes different examples, different ways, the range of meanings, uh, you know, that can be associated with being in the world, the range of being in, the different ways of being in, definite particular ways of being in, all the examples are part of this. The multiplicity of these kinds of being in can be suggested by the examples, by very many examples to have to do with something. It could be to produce order and take care of something, to use something, to give something and let it get lost, to undertake, to accomplish, to find out, to observe, to determine, to speak about, to ask, and so forth. So, thus, being in is not a quality which the saint sometimes has and sometimes chooses not to have. It is not that the saint cannot as well as can do without being in. It is not the case that human being is always already, and then on the top of that it has a relation with the world. What I'm trying to say is this human being is existence is cannot be at any point said as just being or is uh, as an isolated in isolation from the being of the world. It is never like that. It is not the human is and then on top of that it has its relation uh, to the world, to the being of the world, and something that it sometimes takes upon itself and sometimes does not. The being of the world at no point can be separated from the human being. There is no human being, according to Heidegger, outside of the being of the world, right? So sometimes it is not the case that the isolated human being sometimes takes upon itself the being of the world, and sometimes it can isolate itself. It has a primal, uh, uh, kind of existence outside of this, outside of the being of the world. It is not like that. So the Zen understands itself, which also includes an understanding of the being in the world. This understanding of self comes from the understanding of the world ontologically in terms of other beings and their being, which it itself is not, but which it is encountering within the world. This takes us to Jacques Derrida, actually, the deconstructionist, who says that meaning is constantly deferred. There is no meaning in itself. All the structuralists say that. Reimers, Todorov, they are all saying this. It is only this paradigmatic chain of, signification, and signification is constantly being eluded. Uh, we arrive at meaning through through approaching other categories, other abutting adjacent categories. Meaning is not in itself. Meaning is only in it exists in opposition to others, in relation to other, in a constellation of other meanings, right? So we cannot have a meaning of self outside this being of the world. The two are interspersed. One is kind of defining the other, and so we are constantly encountering others, and that's how we are encountering ourselves, right? uh, we are discovering the world, and therefore we are discovering ourselves. So the cognition of world or knowing, uh, or addressing oneself to the world and discussing it through logos or language. In other words, inscribing the world in word functions as the primary mode of being in the world. How do we conceive the world in our limited matter, the individual self that we are? Through word, through logos. So that being in the world is not understood as such. So, the mode of being or the same as being in the world has its ontic foundation in the constitution of being. Now, phenomenally, knowing is a kind of being uh, in being in the world, right? One might, however, object or question that with such an interpretation of the process of knowing, the problem of uh, knowledge is annihilated, right? Uh, so, knowing and being are constantly uh, changing, uh, growing, evolving, uh, influencing one another, then there might not be a finished concept or a knowledge uh, which gives shape to an institution. An institution is always based on finished knowledge, definitive knowledge, which might become elusive if knowledge and being are tied together and they are constantly, kind of shifting, moving, adopting something new, and so forth. So the Zen gains a new perspective of being toward the world, uh, a world that, however, is always already discovered within the same. The same that is approaching the world, defining itself through the world, but which is already always there in the same. It is trying to discover it outwardly, but it is also present within it, right? This is also something that the novel says. What does the novel say? The journey is on the outer, the seeking of meanings of existence, seeking for the questions of existence are on the outer, and then there is a psychic journey. We see that the answers lie within. The new possibility of being can be independently developed, which in turn becomes a task and a scientific knowledge that takes over uh, or becomes a guidance for being in the world. Being in the world as a fundamental constitution requires an a priori interpretation too. So, worldliness is an ontological concept and designates the structure of a constitutive factor of being in the world. So, being in the world is an existential determination of Dasein. Uh, Accordingly, worldliness is itself an existential. When we inquire ontologically about the world, by no means are we abandoning an analysis of Dasein. World is ontologically not a determination of those beings that Dasein essentially is not. Rather, it is a characteristic of Dasein itself. The world is a characteristic of Dasein itself. This is something that I have been trying to drive home from my, in my previous lecture and in this lecture too. So, there is a multiplicity of meanings of the word world. World could mean an array of things. And this multiplicity points towards the phenomena that is intended in their various meanings, in the very many meanings and manifestations, as well as the connections between these different meanings. World could mean very many things, many meanings, many manifestations, and they are interconnected. So, the world can be used as an ontic concept which signifies how the beings are objectively present within the world, and at the same time the world can function in an ontological term which signifies the being of those beings that are named, uh, what it means for multiple beings to be or exist. So, understanding the world in an ontic sense entails a factical the same, living in the world. And this is not, however, the same Dasein that you know, that encounters the world. It's not the same as the Dasein that can be encountered and that actively encounters within the world. So, world has a pre-ontological existential meaning. There are various possibilities here. The world could refer to the public world of the we, or conversely, one's own and nearest, localized world, the world that is immediately surrounding us. For example, the home. So, world designates the ontological and existential concept of worldliness. World designates the ontological and existential concept of worldliness. Worldliness itself can be modified into the respective structural totality of particular worlds. These particular worlds that contain the a priori of worldliness in general. So, world can be modified, worldliness can be modified into the this structural totality of particular worlds. There are several worlds within the world, right? The ontological and existential concept, and each of these worlds, self-complete worlds, contain an a priori, notion of worldliness in them. Now, Heidegger uses a term Zuhändenheit. Zuhändenheit refers to the handiness or a kind of the ontological, categorical definition of beings as they are in themselves. In the ontological interpretation, handiness proves to be the kind of being of beings that is first discovered within the world. Joining these beings, however, together does not result in a sum that amounts to the world. The world could be more or less than the sum of all the beings. World itself is not an inner worldly being, and yet it determines inner worldly beings to such an extent that they can only be encountered and discovered. So these beings can show themselves in their being because there is the world, or the world exists. So the possibilities, the very many possibilities in the different multiple beings can be explored because the world in the first place exists. They exist in the world, in smaller worlds, and they internalize the worldliness, the essence of worldliness that the world also has, right? And they replicate that worldliness, they reproduce that worldliness. However, a sum of all beings may not be the world. The world may be more or less than the sum of all these beings. These beings, the possibility of these beings is only, manifested because the world exists as such. The same manifests in its heedful associations, uh, opening a path to pursue and further illumine a phenomenon, uh, and to attempt to position or place a phenomenon and then interrogate the structures that are evident in it. Now, we were talking about handiness or Zuhandenheit. Now, things at hand could be present in different ways. We have two terms here. One is conspicuousness of the things at hand, and then obtrusiveness. Conspicuousness presents the thing at hand in a certain unhandiness, which implies that what is unusable just lies around and shows itself as a thing of use, and therefore which can be present with some form of outward appearance in its handiness. On the other hand, Obtrusiveness reveals itself as something intractable, comparatively more intractable and merely objectively present, which cannot be therefore, uh, uh, budged or used without missing an element. The helpless way in which we stand before it discovers the mere objective presence of what is at hand. Uh, it so the difference between something that is not being used but can potentially be used, uh, I mean, that is conspicuousness. Conspicuousness of a thing at hand means that it is currently not being used, but it can it shows itself as a thing of use, not as intractable, intransigent as obtrusiveness, which is a thing at hand and cannot, and if we try to budge it, we are only compromising or missing out on one of the elements, right? So it is just there. The obtrusive object in hand is there, it is objectively present, and I mean, there is a helplessness in the way in which we stand before it, right? It does not allow itself uh, to be uh, moved or used at the cost of nothing. So the modes of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy have the function of bringing to the fore the character of objective presence of what is at hand. What is at hand, the object that is at hand, is not merely observed and stared at simply as something objectively present. The character of objective presence making itself known is bound to the handiness of useful things. So, objective presence is inaccessible to circumspection insofar as circumspection concentrates on beings, but it is always already disclosed for that circumspection. So, when we say to disclose here, it is in the sense of something that is already open and not something that has to be obtained indirectly through inference or conclusion. So the world, when the world does not make itself known, that is the condition for the possibility of what is at hand uh, not emerging from its inconspicuousness. The world not making itself known is the condition of the possibility of the thing at hand not disclosing itself from its inconspicuousness. This is the constitution of the phenomenal structure of the being in itself of such objective presences or beings. I would like to stop our lecture here today and let's meet for another round of discussions in another lecture. Thank you.